So earlier when I said you want the unbeliever to take evil seriously, that's because you don't want them to kind of weasel out later with, evil is just what makes people unhappy. Evil is just a relative judgment dependent upon your desires or your ultimate goals. When a person condemns child molestation, or you can pick whatever example you want, they are assuming moral absolutes. But moral absolutes cannot be made sense of, are not intelligible except in the Christian worldview. So up on the board here, when we look at the four things we're considering, remember the preconditions of intelligibility. The problem of evil is not even intelligible. You can't even make sense of the problem of evil unless you begin with the Christian conception of the world. The reply that we'll sometimes get to this is, well, maybe as an unbeliever, I'm not able to call something evil, but the fact is that you Christians, within the circle of your thinking, still have a paradox that has not been resolved. Okay? The unbeliever says, I don't have the right to call that evil, but you call that evil, and I want to know how you can call that evil and still believe that God is all powerful and God is all good. And kind of, brighten your eyes here, nod your heads. You understand how this is a slightly different approach to the problem? Now we need to answer, how can we believe that there's no inconsistency there? And this is where presuppositional thinking, I think, is so powerful. Remember that we always evaluate our experiences or the particulars that we encounter in light of our ultimate assumptions, our presuppositions. If I'm a Christian, I presuppose God's revelation of himself, what he says about himself in the scriptures. And we learn in the scriptures that God is all good, God is all powerful. We also learn in the scriptures that evil exists, but for the time being, I'll just say that's something we observe in the world. If my ultimate presupposition is the goodness and the power of God, and then someone points to evil in the world, I'm going to evaluate that in light of my presuppositions and draw what conclusion? I'm going to draw the conclusion there's a morally sufficient reason for that evil that we find in the world. Okay? If that is my worldview, it is perfectly logical for me to draw the conclusion, not that God doesn't exist, but that God must have a good reason for what he's done. And with that, there is no longer a logical problem of evil. The logical problem just dissolved. That is, I took the logical sting out of it by adding this other proposition. You see, the problem of evil ultimately, I don't think, is a logical difficulty for people. It isn't all that difficult to point out, well, if God has a good reason for the evil, then it's not, something contrary to his character. If God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil that exists, as the Bible teaches us, his goodness and power are not challenged by the reality of evil events or evil things in human experience. The only logical problem which arises in connection with discussions of evil is the unbeliever's philosophical inability to account for the objectivity of his moral judgments. The problem which men have with God when they come face to face with evil and suffering in the world, I want to maintain, is not philosophical, but it's psychological. That is to say, we all find it emotionally very hard to have faith in God and trust his goodness and power when we are not given the reason why bad things happen to us and others. See, the unbeliever presents the problem of evil I'm suggesting, whether he says it explicitly or not, with this underlying demand. If there's a morally sufficient reason for this evil, then I need to know what it is. Why did such terrible things happen? Unbelievers internally cry out for an answer to that question. By the way, believers do too, as I've already confessed. But God does not always, and indeed, if I read the Bible correctly, he rarely provides an explanation to human beings for the evil that they experience or that they observe. In Deuteronomy 29:29, we read, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God." As an aside, I might add, even if God told us why evil things took place, we might not understand it. There's kind of an arrogance in Dr. Bahnsen or you or the unbeliever when we say, God, give me a reason for why I'm suffering. Because if God were to state to us the reason, we might be totally baffled. And that's because, as Isaiah tells us, God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. God may be doing things with the evil you're undergoing or that your loved ones undergo, doing things which are so complex and so, in a sense, mysterious, that even if He told you, you might not understand it. But anyway, God doesn't usually tell us why we suffer evil. Nevertheless, the fact remains that though He hasn't given us the reason for our misery and suffering or the injustice of this world, they are part of His plan for history and for our individual lives. And as God says, for those who love Him, everything will work together for good, and those who don't love Him are going to be ultimately cursed, eternally cursed. So the Bible, you see, calls on us to trust that God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil that is found in this world. But the Bible does not give us the reason or reasons that are morally sufficient for the evil, leaving it up to us then to finally judge whether God has been good or not. But the unbeliever will find that intolerable. Intolerable for his pride, for his feelings, maybe for his rationality, because he refuses to trust God. He won't believe in a God that doesn't tell him why evil things take place. The unbeliever says, unless I'm given the reason that I can examine and assess, I won't believe in Him. And so let's, put it briefly. Look at the whole story, reduce it now. The bottom line is the unbeliever won't trust God unless God subordinates himself to the intellectual authority and the moral evaluation of the unbeliever. That's what it comes down to. The unbeliever says, let God be on trial, and when I'm satisfied that He has a good enough reason for the evil, then I'll trust in Him. Unless God consents to trade places with the sinner won't trust Him. Now, what do you think? Is God willing to enter into that kind of negotiation? God says, well, since you're the guilty party, I'll have you judge me. No. The problem of evil comes down to the question of whether a person should have faith in God and His Word rather than place faith in one's own thinking and evaluations and values.